Peace and all good, people of God, from Franciscan Media. I am Father Jim Sabak, and this is the Inbreaking of the Word. This past Sunday, December the 1st, 2024, we celebrated the first Sunday of Advent, the beginning not just of a new liturgical season within our church, but also the beginning of a new church year. We now enter into the Gospel of Luke, the year of Luke, having concluded the Gospel of Mark and the year of Mark last year, or basically, last year, but last Sunday, we now journey with Luke and Luke's understanding and what Luke can open for us of the mission of Christ's gospel message. But we begin with Advent, as we begin every new year, again, every church season that switches from one gospel to the next. The thing about Advent, though, is that we just sometimes see it as the preparation for Christmas. And that's good, but not enough, ever. Advent is a rich, complex, convoluted, conflicting season, which we're not given enough time to truly enter into, both because of the number of days on the calendar that Advent holds, but also because our society and culture throw so much at us of responsibilities, expectations, distractions, what have you, that seem to get in the way of really celebrating Advent in its fullness. Nothing wrong with those expectations or those distractions. They're quite enjoyable, and we're not to reject them. But we also have to give Advent its due. But in order to do that, we have to recognize a few things about Advent. Again, like I said, it's a complex and conflicting season. It's a season that looks both to the birth of Christ in Bethlehem in history, but then also looks to the fulfillment of God's promises at the end of time. In addition, in actuality, the second coming of Christ. Within that, basically, is then a whole bunch of imagery, again, of light and darkness, of hope and of terror, of joy and of sorrow, of all these things coming together, basically all the great fears and longings, all these great things that sort of work within us, that sometimes get in the way to distract us from who we are called to be and what we must be as a people of faith, as a people of belief in a world that sometimes finds it very difficult or frightening to believe in anything at all. And so this great season of Advent. What is even more so about this season of Advent is that it has more days in it than does the season of Easter. By reckoning again, Advent should have shorter days to lead into a greater season with more days that Christmas is. Just like Lent has 40 days and leads into a greater season of Easter with 50 days. That's not the case with Advent. This year, Advent has, because we began on December the 1st, 24 days. Christmas only has 19 days, 7 in December, 12 in January. And so why? Why is Christmas shorter than the Advent season? Because again, maybe this says something to us about the more that Advent is, not just preparation to remember the birth of a child in Bethlehem, but what does it mean to be people ever vigilant? People who are ever looking, yearning, longing for the fulfillment of God's promises. That God said, I will not leave you orphan. I will not abandon you. I've carved you in the palm of my hand. I am with you always unto the end of time. What does that really mean for us? How do we live our lives in light of those truths that God cannot go back upon, that God will fulfill? How can we remain ever vigilant and ever faithful to those fulfillment of God's promises and not lose hope ourselves? Because if we lose hope, then the world loses hope. And that is never good for the world. That is never good for the fulfillment of God's promises. And so within that, we recognize that the first part, again, of this Lenten season, like I said, focused upon the coming of Christ at the end of time. Only the last week, the coming of Christ, in Bethlehem. Within all of this, again, is this great Scotistic, John Duns Scotus teaching, again, that what is happening in the birth of this child is not because of sin, is not because we ate an apple that we should not have eaten at the beginning of time. It is because it is God's will. It is God's promise being fulfilled. It is God basically saying this needs to be done to further what it is that I intend for this world to become. And so within all of that, that vigilant waiting for God to fulfill God's promises is ratcheted up, so that we begin to see that it is not because of brokenness that we need this Christ. It is because about who it is that we must become that we need this Christ. And so these readings that lead us into this season, Jeremiah, Israel in exile, not because God wants it in exile, not because God has punished it and placed it in exile. It's because of Israel's obstinacy, its stupidity, its ridiculous choices. It's not recognizing its mistakes. And yet God does not abandon Israel, but says, I will bring you back to a new Jerusalem, a better Jerusalem, a rebuilt Jerusalem, to bring back what has fallen apart. This is God's design and God's desire. God is with Israel in exile, and God wants to bring Israel back. Not just a God who punishes and forgets, but a God who remembers and asks Israel to do the same. The first letter to the Thessalonians, Paul basically telling the Thessalonians, be a people whose love is remarkable. Be a people whose love gains renown. Be a people whose love becomes so exceptional that it gives people a second glance at who these Christians are. Because it is love that is making the world notice us more. Not what we know and not what we do, but not what we do in love, yes, but not what we do in accomplishments and successes. But the extent to which we love allows this world to understand the presence of God, that it always remains within it. And then Luke's gospel, basically about the end of time, in vivid imagery that would make, again, any Hollywood blockbuster sell thousands of tickets. And yet in the midst of all of this chaos and screaming and things falling from the sky and what have you, we are told to embrace it. We are told to stand tall, to hold our heads high, because our redemption is at hand and we need to welcome it. A very different understanding, again, of endings than our world can ever understand. And yet this is our difference as believers in the world. A God who promises, again, that what happens at the end will be for glory and fulfillment and not for destruction. A God who promises us a future that cannot be taken away, a future that cannot be discredited, a future that cannot be forfeit, because the future lies with God, always with God. And the progress of humanity is to move so that God is all in all and always a part of who and what we are called to be as human beings of this good earth. A blessed Advent season, people of God. May the Lord give you his peace.